Tonight, no let-up. Russia's relentless attacks on residential areas intensify, violating ceasefire agreements intended to give citizens in Ukraine a chance to escape, and alarm.
We look to Vienna and we're deeply troubled by what we see.
Israel's chief takeaway of the Iran nuclear deal in the works. At home, gas prices soaring as the value of a dollar drops, even at the dollar store.
That's part of life in the United States.
Plus,
these are the prepared Molotov cocktails, and they are actually ready for use.
A city on war footing. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. Ceasefire in name only as Russia escalates its attacks on Ukrainian citizens. Welcome to Faith Nation. In Washington, I'm Jenna Browder. The third round of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine ending today without any major breakthroughs. Russia demanding Ukraine stop all military activity, recognize Crimea as Russian territory, also recognize the independence of the two separatist regions in the east, and finally, give up aspirations to join the EU or NATO. CBN News national security correspondent Caitlin Burke is following the developments and joins us with the latest. Caitlin?
In terms of those demands, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says he won't respond to Russian ultimatums. During today's talks, there was allegedly progress made on the establishment of humanitarian corridors to allow civilians to evacuate. But this is the third time that we've heard that. The first two failed, with Ukraine claiming Russian shelling never stopped. So we'll have to see if anything is different this time. Now, a senior defense official says 100% of Putin's pre-staged combat forces are now in Ukraine. The Biden administration is in talks with Poland in an effort to provide Ukraine with more assistance, this time in the form of fighter jets.
We're talking about Polish planes, right? These fighter jets that they are requesting. We're working with Poland on this issue and consulting with the rest of our NATO allies on it. This is Poland's sovereign decision to make. We have in no way opposed Poland transferring planes to Ukraine.
Now, there are a number of logistical challenges with this effort, like how to get planes from Poland to Ukraine. And then another part of the deal is that Poland would send Ukraine fighter jets and the U.S. would provide Poland with new planes. However, procuring new jets can take years, so that timeline issue is still being worked out. President Zelensky continues to push for the West to help in establishing a no-fly zone over Ukraine, something Secretary of State Antony Blinken addressed today during a news conference in Latvia.
The no-fly zone, to be very clear about what that involves, that means that if Russian planes violate the zone that's declared, we shoot them down. And that runs the considerable risk of creating a direct conflict between our countries and Russia, and thus a wider war, which is in no one's interest, including in the interest of the Ukrainian people.
Another new development today, the Pentagon has ordered an additional 500 U.S. soldiers to deploy to different parts of Europe to further support our NATO allies. Jenna?
All right, National Security Correspondent Caitlin Burke, thank you. Well, this is the worst refugee crisis since World War II. More than 1.7 million Ukrainians fleeing to neighboring countries. For those choosing to stay, they are fighting back using sophisticated weapons provided by the United States and other countries. Brody Carter has that part of the story.
The fire broke out after Russian troops shelled the plant in the dark of night, raising fears of a disaster that could affect Europe for decades. But threats of any nuclear damage were extinguished with reports the fire had been put out. The reactor unit wasn't damaged, and no change in radiation has been recorded so far. Still, nuclear safety experts warn that waging war around such facilities could mean extreme risks. Ukraine is surrounded from all sides. Warships loom on the Black Sea, threatening the city of Odessa, while inching closer to strategic southern port cities, this after taking its largest prize, Kherson. The fighting remains intense. In Mariupol, civilians take the brunt of Russian aggression. Shelling has destroyed access to water and electricity, and Russia expected to take over soon.
Les forces russes bombardent Kiev.
And French President Emmanuel Macron believes the worst of the fighting is still to come after talking to Vladimir Putin on the phone Thursday. Macron says Putin wants to take control of all of Ukraine, and the Russian war machine inches closer to the capital of Kyiv. But Ukrainians have been fighting back with the help of key weaponry from countries like the United States, sending hundreds of Stinger anti-craft missiles capable of shooting down helicopters.
The Stingers can be used in a so-called shoulder-launched mode. They are infrared-guided missiles that don't have quite the range or altitude ceiling of a radar-guided missile, but they do have the ability to essentially be stealthy.
Michael O'Hanlon, senior fellow at the Brookings Institute.
They just need their own passive infrared detection system to hone in on a target. So if you're standing on the ground and you've got one of these Stingers, and it's just a small team of Ukrainians who could do it, you can launch at the airplane and it's sort of fire and forget, and the Russians won't even know what's coming.
Yes! Yes, блядь! Два!
Another weapon helping Ukrainians on the ground, the Javelin. Similar to a Stinger, but aimed at destroying Russian tanks.
And, you know, with the extent of the road network right now in Ukraine and the amount of conditions that tend to prevail this time of year with snow and then soon mud, the Russians can't easily move off the roads. So if they're moving down predictable locations, predictable arteries, and then the Ukrainians can range up and down those roads with Javelin weapons, they can take out a lot of vehicles. I think that's part of why we're seeing this, you know, infamous 40-mile-long Russian convoy near Kiev struggle so much to move southward. It's just got these kinds of obstacles and weapons up against it.
Civilians have their own weapons. CBN's George Thomas in Ukraine shows how people can make and use what's called
a Molotov cocktail. You have gasoline, petrol in here, an oil base, they said pineapple a little bit, and this is the fuse. You light this sucker right here, you light this, and you basically throw this at a tank. And the idea is that you throw it, you aim the bottle, the Molotov cocktail, kind of around the engine and the chains of the tank. And this may seem primitive, but it's very effective, and we've seen that around the world. Again, just another sign of what Ukrainians from all walks of life are willing to do in order to preserve their nation, preserve their independence, and to fight for freedom.
And even if or when Russia does capture Ukraine, the people could still keep fighting back in an insurgency that could lead to years of guerrilla warfare. That could pose a massive problem for Putin.
He's made a big mistake, and he's got to find some way to minimize his exposure, because otherwise he could have the same kind of saga in Ukraine that we had in Iraq or Afghanistan, or worse.
Brody Carter, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Brody. Well, the situation in Ukraine is spiking gas prices here at home. The national average topping $4 a gallon for the first time since 2008. And some drivers paying as much as $7 a gallon in places like Los Angeles. And there's no end in sight, with the surge in fuel costs expected to break an all-time record as soon as this evening. It all comes as the U.S. inches closer to the prospect of banning Russian oil, and that means prices could go even higher. And here with us now, Nathan Gonzalez, editor and publisher of Inside Elections. Nathan, thank you for coming on tonight. So let's start there. Both Democrat and Republican lawmakers are calling on President Biden to ban Russian oil and gas in the U.S. With gas prices as high as they are right now, and this also being a midterm year, do you think this is a move the White House would take?
Well, it looks like both Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill are a little further ahead than the White House on this in terms of wanting to go ahead and do it. And I think it has public support on one level. The question is at the next level, that are the American people, do they have an appetite for higher gas prices that could come with a decision like this? And there's definitely disagreement on what to do without the influx of Russian oil into the economy. Now, the Republicans want to say, you know, open up the domestic sources, open up the Keystone Pipeline. Democrats are more likely to want to search for cleaner energy sources, or the White House working with other countries, even countries that don't have a great record themselves on what to do. So at one level, I think there's consensus, but it'll get messy politically as we go further along.
Yeah, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki was pressed on that point today, why the administration is, okay, asking countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela to pump more oil, but very hesitant to do it domestically here. There's also a strong bipartisan push to supply weapons to Ukrainians fighting the Russian invasion, and President Zelensky is imploring the help of Western nations pretty much on a daily basis to establish a no-fly zone. Nathan, polling shows many Americans, most Americans, do support a no-fly zone. But do you think that takes into account the consequences of doing that, essentially pulling the U.S. and NATO into war with Russia?
Jenna, I think you've nailed it. I think that a no-fly zone in those words sounds easy, right? Just no flying over a specific zone. But the consequences and the very real possibility that the Secretary of State laid out that this would escalate, that the U.S. and NATO would be directly involved in a war with Russia is not something that I think is popular. I think if we got to the point where our men and women, either on the ground or pilots, are being shot down and killed, I think that would quickly turn against the White House and the current Democrats in leadership.
We've seen just an incredible logistical effort to supply Ukrainian defenders with weapons. What about the idea of the plane swap, basically transferring Soviet-made fighter jets to Ukraine from Poland, and then the U.S. would in turn give Poland much more advanced F-16s? One snag is that those F-16s are promised to Taiwan, but is that one way to avoid U.S. and NATO involvement in a no-fly zone, or would Russia consider that an escalation to just a few seconds?
Well, it feels like Russia is going to consider almost everything an escalation. But coming from someone without a military background, and I'm not a military commander, but it does look like a way to be involved and to support the cause of the Ukrainian people and military without being in that direct head-to-head conflict with Russia, which clearly we don't want at this point.
All right, Nathan Gonzalez of Inside Elections, always good to have you. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you, Jenna.
Well, while the world remains focused on Ukraine, a major geopolitical event is also unfolding in Vienna, where world powers are reportedly close to signing a renegotiated Iran nuclear deal. As CBN's Chris Mitchell reports, some are concerned this version is worse than the original.
After 11 months of negotiations, Israel's chief takeaway is alarm.
We look to Vienna and we're deeply troubled by what we see. For Israel and all the stability-seeking forces in the Middle East, the emerging deal, as it seems, is highly likely to create a more violent, more volatile Middle East.
They said that they were going to get a longer and stronger deal. This deal will be shorter and weaker.
Just days before an expected announcement, former State Department advisor on Iran, Gabriel Naronha, released information provided to him by current State Department officials.
My former colleagues I worked with, who were really so distressed by what they were seeing that they asked me to go public with these details because they said that Congress had not been informed and the American public hadn't been informed, and they were just so worried with the concessions that were being made by the negotiating teams that they felt that they needed to say something about it.
Naronha says the deal clears the way for a nuclear Iran.
Unfortunately, they're not getting any of the sunsets on Iran's nuclear restrictions lifted or extended. And so in only 9 years, Iran will have a clear path to a nuclear weapon. The American people need to know that this deal is illegal. It is dangerous to American national security. It's dangerous to the regional and global security in both the short term and in the long term.
Russia, a key player in these negotiations, wants written guarantees from the U.S. that sanctions from its war on Ukraine will not stop its trade with Iran. Israeli Prime Minister Bennett met with Putin on Saturday in Moscow about the war in Ukraine, although it's expected they discussed the nuclear deal and Russia's ongoing support for Iran. The deal would also reportedly provide billions in sanctions relief to Iran.
There are no restrictions in this deal on how that money will be spent and fueled to Iran's proxies. So we can expect that a lot is going to go to Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis. And so we're going to really see over the next few years, it might take a few months to get going, we're going to see a rapid proliferation of terrorist activity We're going to see more destabilizing activity, and we're going to see Iran's influence and power grow in the region.
That power represents an existential threat to Israel.
Let me be clear. Israel will not accept Iran as a nuclear threshold state. Israel will always maintain its freedom of action to defend itself.
Israel's pledge to defend itself, along with Iran's nuclear ambition, puts these two enemies on a collision course for war. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Inflation in America at a 40-year high. Coming up, the value of a dollar and what it means for shoppers at dollar and discount stores. Skyrocketing inflation as more Americans pinching pennies and turning to discount and dollar stores to buy the basics. But the tough economic climate is forcing those businesses to change some policies in order to stay viable. Here's Mark Martin.
When Aisha Williams made a trip to Dollar Tree, she was in for a surprise.
I was a little shocked at first when I went in for the first time, and it was like, oh my gosh, 25, I was expecting $1, so I was really thrown off by it.
The Virginia resident now plans to shop at Dollar Tree less often due to the increase to $1.25.
Actually, I went into the store and bought something, and it rang up as $1.25, and I asked him about that.
Lee Dean feels the increase makes sense in light of supply issues and the pandemic, and also sees the flip side.
I also feel like it's probably a lot for people who are relying on Dollar Tree and dollar stores for, a lot of their food and whatever. I mean, it's 25% higher, so that could probably hurt a lot of people.
Dollar Tree issued a statement about the increase, saying it was the right time to make the move in order to continue offering extreme value to customers. The company called the decision permanent and said it wasn't a reaction to temporary or short-term market conditions. CEO Michael Witynski added Dollar Tree pricing tests showed broad consumer acceptance of the price increase.
It's not going to turn me away from coming in. Like I said, it depends on what you buy. Stuff's still a good deal. You just got to be a smart shopper.
It's very sensible to do that. I mean, every other industry has raised prices. Food services, automobile industry, that's part of life in the United States.
Still, industry tracker Coresight Research found Dollar Tree experienced a meaningful decline in shoppers after the price increase during a check around the Christmas holidays. As for competitor Dollar General, the discount store says 20% of its merchandise goes for $1 or less. Mark Martin, CBN News.
Russia laying siege to major cities across Ukraine. Up next, the life or death measures citizens are taking to protect themselves and their country. Welcome back. Residents of Lviv, Ukraine are on war footing, anticipating Russia's military operations could spread westward. Here's CBN's George Thomas.
It's the sounds and sights of a city that's on a war footing.
We have food, we have medicines, we have all kinds of different things, and we sort them into categories here.
At Lviv's historic art palace, now a massive aid hub, hundreds of volunteers use every inch of this 32,000 square foot structure to store critical supplies that fleeing refugees and military personnel might need in the days ahead.
We are all united, and now everyone is helping, and we're doing everything we can.
In one corner, food. In another, clothes, sleeping bags, and blankets. Here, medical supplies and toiletry. And in this spot, sacks of potatoes. Lviv has been a safe zone since Russia's invasion. Tens of thousands of people are pouring in by the day, and residents are stepping up to help.
And now the most awful thing is that we are getting accustomed to them, to all this situation. First days, all these first waves of shock, it's like settling down, and now this is the reality, and this is just the job we must do.
Yet there's a sense of urgency here. You feel it. You see it. On the streets, Ukraine's National Guard is out in force. At sensitive locations like police stations, hospitals, and government buildings, security has been beefed up. if the Russians were to move on Lviv, one of their first targets is going to be City Hall, right here in the heart of Lviv. And so already authorities have put up the sandbags and erected these concrete barriers just in case. CBN News filmed as military instructors were teaching civilians how to handle weapons and man checkpoints. Ruslan Shenitsky is playing his part as well, cutting large pieces of metal.
The goal is to erect these steel barriers to stop Russian tanks from advancing on the city.
These are the prepared Molotov cocktails, and they are actually ready for use. And these bottles, they are prepared to be transported because they are covered here.
They have a seal on them.
Yeah.
Taras Masalko does public relations for one of Ukraine's largest breweries.
So basically to fill up the bottles and use them to put gasoline and all the stuff that's needed.
The company has ditched beers for producing petrol bombs to set fire to any invading Russian army.
We need to be prepared, and we need to be sure that we can normally defend our houses and our cities.
Back at the Art Palace, volunteers work around the clock. This is the largest humanitarian center with 8 others scattered around the city.
People are really exhausted. They're coming and they're saying, okay, I can stay for like 5 hours, but they're working for 12 hours.
George Thomas, CBN News, Lviv, Ukraine.
Still ahead, till death do us part. A Christian couple in Ukraine takes their wedding vows on the front lines. Finally tonight, living proof that love is stronger than war. As thousands of young men rush to enlist in Ukraine's army, one couple there decided there's no better time than right now to take their vows and tie the knot over the weekend. The young Christian couple chose to marry in a hurry just minutes before the groom went off to the front lines. The pastor who performed the intimate ceremony is a Ukrainian and a military chaplain himself. In the service, he thanked God that even in the midst of war, a beautiful family has been born. And we wish them well. Congratulations. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. Have a great evening.